Check. Sound check. 1, 2, 3, 4. Is the sound on? Check. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Testing, 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 testing. Don't think it's on. Testing, testing. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear that, everyone? No, not real good. Yeah. Kathy's just coming down. Sorry, folks, we're just having some sound difficulties tonight, but we will get it sorted out here. So testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. There it is. I can hear it now. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. All right, I think maybe we're okay. As long as we have sound up in the AV booth, then we're good. Awesome. Think we're okay? Are we okay, Kathy? All right. All right. Here's hoping. Say a prayer, everybody. So good evening. I'm Brenda Curtis, and I serve in ministry with the community here at Grace-Westminster United Church. And I would like to welcome you in person and also welcome those who have joined us online by live stream. I would like to welcome you to our congregation, our church here tonight, and our presentation with the Reverend Dr. Bill Richards. The month of October marks the Olive Harvest Program of Education and Advocacy that was prepared by members of the Mennonite Church and the United Church Living Skies Regional Council. We who are here on the prairies, who are also in the midst of the harvest season, we seek to stand in solidarity with farmers in Palestine, many of whom cannot harvest their olives this year because of the ongoing genocide, death, and destruction of the people, culture, and lands. As Bishop Rod Andrews from the Anglican Church recently wrote when he promoted the Olive Harvest events in his denomination, he said this: "Harvest on the prairies is well underway. We enjoy warm days, cool nights, and autumn breezes. We reap our harvest without fear of missiles flying overhead and bombs exploding around us. We send our children and our grandchildren to school, knowing that they will be safe. Farmers in Palestine reap the olive harvest in constant anxiety and fear." And so as we meet tonight, we do feel the pain and we see the suffering of the Palestinian people. And we understand that it is the same pain and suffering that we have seen before here in our own country, as the indigenous peoples of this land were also decimated by colonial power. And so we acknowledge the history of our land, this earth that we meet on tonight, by acknowledging the history of our country, and by giving thanks to the indigenous people of Turtle Island who have for millennia worked upon, watched over, and cared for this good earth. Tonight we are gathered on Treaty 6 territory, the historic lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, and Saulteaux people, and the homeland of the Métis. Friends, let us commit ourselves to the ongoing and soul-searching work of truth and reconciliation and peacemaking by living in right relations with all our neighbors, both near and far. All right, a few housekeeping things. We have put out some water at the back. Help yourself if you need a little drink. There's some water there. Washrooms, if you go out the doors that you came in, the washrooms are directly across the hall. You'll see them there. I believe the presentation will take about 45 minutes, Bill. Yeah. And it will be followed by a time of Q&A, some questions, and Bill will offer some insight. Near the end of our evening together, we're going to direct you to some of the things that have been brought to share. We have black ribbons on the back table. So the black ribbon represents mourning, and we offer those tonight as we remember that in these days, today, tomorrow, and the following day, mark a year since the massacre and the ongoing genocide in Palestine. We also have bottles of Zaytoun, Palestinian olive oil, for sale, and you're welcome to talk to Ursula about that. It is very hard to get. I know I was at Salpida. They aren't even expecting to have Palestinian olive oil this fall at all. So it's very hard to get because the harvest has been basically decimated. We also have some sheets for you to take, one that has some information about the remaining events of the October Olive Harvest Month, and also a sheet that you're going to want to take because it has numerous ways that you can become part of the call for a ceasefire to end the genocide in Gaza. So those things we'll talk a little bit about at the end of our time together. But now it is my pleasure to welcome tonight the Reverend Dr. Bill Richards, who will lead us in an exploration of the Scriptures through his presentation on the ethics of reading biblical history, cover stories on a stolen land. Welcome, Bill.
Got it. Yep. Thanks. Well, thank you, Brenda, and thank you, Grace-Westminster United Church, for the invitation to be here. Thank you to the planners in the United Church and the Mennonite Church for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm also grateful to my own Bishop, Rod Andrews, that, as Brenda mentioned, has been very supportive of my teaching and research work, and I'd like to acknowledge his support as being important to me. The title is The Ethics of Reading Biblical History, covers stories on stolen land. And just before I start, for those of you, this is meant to be open to people, whatever your faith background, or if none, that's fine too. And it doesn't presume a knowledge of Bible, but I'll talk a bit about what I can about it. Just some terminology that may be If you're new to the study of antiquity, when we're dating things, we use Common Era, CE, BCE, before Common Era. So we're living in 2024 of the Common Era, CE. And if I talk about 500 BCE, that's 2,524 years ago. That's part of being sensitive to the breadth of background that people come who talk about antiquity. I'll also use the term Jewish Bible rather than Old Testament, which is what Christians use. This seems to be a really important term in terms of volume. But I'll speak of Jewish Bible as that treasure of text that we've inherited from Judaism. Just to be clear, the other point, any religious tradition has its special names for God, and the Hebrew tradition also has its own name for God. And very early on in the stories of writing about this God, the texts were often, they shifted the font just for the name, to cue the reader to show reverence, or perhaps not even to pronounce the name, but to substitute another word. And the range of substitutions varied depending on the era and the stream of Judaism, sometimes simply when they hit this name saying God, or the Lord, or Hashem, the name. It was written just with the consonants Yod, He, Vav, He in Hebrew. When it was pronounced, and one of these other words would be used. Just for clarity to be talking about, I will use the name in my text. I just use the consonants, but I will use the name Yahweh, and I do not mean any disrespect by speaking that name. I simply want to be clear about who one of the key persons is in the story of Jewish Bible. And so to begin. My first teacher of Bible was Edna Doik. Every year for over 40 years, Edna welcomed a new class of a dozen of us 6 or 7-year-olds to begin sharing classic stories of the Bible. Edna taught us about Joseph and his amazing coat of many colors, a gift that so provoked his brothers to jealousy that they sold him off to slavery in Egypt. And about the baby Moses, whose older sister Miriam kept watch over him, snuggled away into his basket, both of them hidden among the reeds of the Nile, their mother having reckoned that the river's crocodiles were less of a risk than Egypt's cruel Pharaoh. And about David, the shepherd boy, who played his very own songs on his very own harp. Edna made sure by the end of that first year with her, we all could recite David's most famous song, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Edna had trained as a teacher, but this teaching of Bible was purely voluntary for 40-plus years at our rural Ontario Village Church, because Edna loved children. Not children in general, but besides her and Harold's own two, Edna loved all the particular children she welcomed into her classroom every year. Edna loved us calling us little jewels, drawing on the words of an old hymn that the rest of our Sunday school would regularly sing, "Like the stars of the morning, God's bright crown adorning, they shall shine in their beauty." And so as a teacher of Bible now myself, I want to hold particular children in mind at the beginning of tonight's presentation. I want to remember the 3,201 children who the Truth and Reconciliation Commission listed as having died in the Canadian residential school system over the century it operated. In 2015, the TRC knew, of course, that many more children had died, but they listed that number in their report as part of documenting just how much higher child mortality within that system was than in the rest of Canadian society at the time. I also want to remember the now 16,500 children who have died so far in the siege of Gaza over the last year, along with another 21,000 currently missing. What I say tonight, I am only too well aware, is absolutely no compensation for the lives that those children should have lived. Those children of Turtle Island and of Palestine, that they should have been allowed to live, children of beautiful lands that nourished their births, lands that have been and are being stolen from under them, and stolen by the pious thieves who like to cite conquest narratives in Jewish Bible as a cover story for their theft. In Canada, Australia, South Africa, America, and Palestine. To unpack the ethics of reading biblical history tonight, I would like us to explore some basic questions behind these oft-cited stories, starting with what is the Jewish Bible and where did it come from? Let me begin with a line of ancient Hebrew poetry found in Jewish Bible from Divrei Amos, the words of Amos. Hello, kavani kshiim, atem li b'nei Yisrael, l'umatanai. Hello, et Yisrael, hailiti me'aretz Mitzrayim, ufalashtaim makaftor, va'aram makir. Are you not the children of Israel and the children of the Cushim alike to me? This is Yahweh speaking. Was it not I who brought Yisrael from the land of the Mitzrayim, and the Philistine from Kaftor, and Aram from Kir? I chose these words to start our exploration because this is the oldest text that I know that mentions both Israel and Palestine in the same paragraph. Divrei Amos, Words of Amos, is a book of prophetic oracles, what Yahweh said, that the seer passes on by way of either warning or promise. The book also contains a short section of 4 parabolic visions. What Yahweh showed me, Amos says, some sight met in the ordinary course of life that struck the seer as a kind of parable for what was going on in his society. A woman carrying a basket of overripe fruit on her head. That's going to take some picking through afterwards. Or stonemasons with a plumb line held against a badly leaning wall, trying to decide repair or simply tear down. There are only a few sentences in the book that suggest a date or location for these poems and visions. The opening sentence indicates a date almost 2,800 years ago, 750 to 725 BCE. A few sentences further on offers a location, Bethel, capital of the 8th century BCE tribal federation known at the time as Israel. Besides being the oldest text I know mentioning both Israel and Palestine together, the other thing that has always struck me about this paragraph is the even-handedness it shows in how this speaker's God Yahweh keeps watch over all nations. Not only just a divine eye on what they might be up to, but also a divine hand guiding them in all their comings and goings. Some of Amos's ancient place and people names we're not entirely sure of. Traditionally, we've read the Cushim as the people of Ethiopia, Mitzrayim as Egypt, Kaftor as Cyprus, Aram as the people of Syria, Kir as Georgia in the Caucasus. Amos's God, it seems, has an eye, hand, and heart for them all. Divrei Amos opens, for example, with words of warning, stern warning, for each of the little warring states at the east end of the Mediterranean of his time, denouncing the theft of labor and life they inflict on one another, his own tribe, Judah, included. The Eastern Mediterranean was and is a rich and fertile land of ancient cities, forests, mines, and watersheds, of grazing lands and settled agriculture. For over 10,000 years, its peoples have lived out their collective lives there and developed their own societies and cultures. And they have done all that in the midst of the imperial powers warring around them. In Amos's time, one great power, Egypt, to the southwest, in the valley of the Nile, emptying into the eastern Mediterranean. Another, Assyria, to the northeast, in the twin valleys of the Tigris-Euphrates, emptying into the Persian Gulf of the Indian Ocean. We owe more than we realize to the long-standing creativity of the people of this region. Even in the modern sciences, we are heirs to their careful studies in arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, engineering, language, and literature. The peoples of the Fertile Crescent between the Nile and Mesopotamia spoke a variety of related languages, dialects of an older language we call Canaanite. Racially, there was no distinction among them, Israelites and Philistines. Both groups belong to what anthropologists today simply call the Mediterranean type. The region's various tribes in their traditional stories about one another showed an awareness of these commonalities. They constructed sometimes elaborate genealogies to explain their various alliances and sometimes conflicted relationships. For example, by naming a common ancestral mother, Hagar, Sarah, Keturah, Rebecca, Leah, Bilhah, Zilpah, Rachel, Asenath, or a common ancestral father, Abraham, Lot, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. These genealogical figures provided the rationale for a variety of political experiments they sometimes vaguely remembered testing, as tribal confederacies or as monarchies or as vassal states, or later as imperial provinces in a succession of empires, Persia from 539 BCE on, various Greek kingdoms from 334 BCE on, and Rome from 63 BCE on. Besides being people with developed skills in engineering and science, they were also peoples who produced a literature in a variety of genres: proverb, prophecy, law, legend, romance, chronicle, genealogy, and cosmology, stories of the beginning of the universe. The Jewish Bible we now read collects under one cover some of that variety of writing generated from across almost 1,000 years of literary activity, a product reflecting various subdialects of Hebrew and Aramaic. But the Jewish Bible is not organized either chronologically, oldest to newest, or by subject matter, science, history, biography, romance, say. Rather, it is organized as a threefold structure under what we might call authority value. Torah, or law in English, Nevi'im, prophets, Ketuvim, writings. At the head of the modern Jewish Bible are 5 scrolls of Torah, law, sometimes also called Pentateuch, 5 scrolls, or the books of Moses. Moses, however, is not their author, but rather a key character in the story they present. He doesn't actually appear on the scene until the beginning of the second book, Exodus. The last of the 5, Deuteronomy, his final lengthy speech before the recording of his death. His speech repeats earlier instructions on how the Hebrew slaves, now free, should build a new life together, and concludes with a song of blessing, warning, should they forget the God who won them their freedom. All 5 scrolls of Torah contain a mix of material: stories, songs, regulations, blessings, curses, lists of ancestors and territories, There's even a sanctuary building manual if you're interested. Some parts of Torah are quite old. The Song of Rescue at the Sea that Moses' sister Miriam is recorded as singing, for example. The form of Torah as we now have it, however, likely comes from the Persian imperial period, 500 to 300 BCE. Its first translations into Aramaic, the common language under the Persians, and Greek, the common language under the Egyptian Greeks, were made about 350 BCE and 250 BCE, respectively. That's the first section. The final section of Jewish Bible, Ketuvim writings, came together much later from rabbinic debates on this subject, probably not until sometime after 200 CE. This section contains song collections like David's Psalms or Jeremiah's Laments or Solomon's Song of Songs, i.e. a Hebrew idiom for the best song. And guess what the best song is about? Love. Here too are proverb collections of Solomon, Hezekiah, Agur, and Lemuel, revised chronicles and short novels of past heroes, male and female, as much to entertain, we think, as to instruct. Ruth, Daniel, Esther. But it is the middle section of the Jewish Bible, Nevi'im, prophets, that we most need to focus on for this discussion of ethical reading tonight. This middle section combines two very different kinds of writing gathered into two subsections. The latter subsection is mostly poetry, like what we read in Amos, oracles in verse credited to various particular prophetic figures believed to have delivered them: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, or the 12 so-called minor prophets, among them Amos. And as we found with Amos, most of these collections offer little backstory to the oracles recorded. The former part of Nevi'im, prophets, however, is written in narrative form, presenting a reconstructed story running from the arrival of Hebrew slaves in Palestine to the collapse of their various states to imperial powers, from Moses' successor Joshua through subsequent tribal leaders and prophetic advisors, judges, including the great seer Samuel, credited with anointing the first kings of the Hebrew people, Saul, then David. Stories of kings after David and their advisors make up the last part of this narrative half, Kings. Its story ends with the destruction of the city-state of Jerusalem by the imperial Babylonian armies, appointment of a puppet governor, and a final report on the surviving members of the Davidic royal family living as prisoners of war in Babylon. Now, one of the critical issues around reading this reconstructed story that the former prophets of Jewish Bible presents over the millennia since its first appearance is that various imperial powers since have read themselves into this subsection's conquest and succession narratives as a cover story for their own colonizing projects. These imperial powers have read themselves as this text's chosen people for their own time, claiming, entering, and conquering their own promised land wherever they have conveniently found themselves, in the Americas, Australia, Africa, and Palestine. Themselves chosen by this ancient text God, taking lands presently occupied by others, but according to this ancient text's supposedly divine promise, lands self-righteously theirs for the taking. We'll come back to these loaded phrases, chosen people and promised land. But first we need to say a bit more about exactly what this section, this particular section of Jewish Bible, the former prophets, actually is, how it was put together, and why. From historical critical biblical studies of the last 2 centuries, we have come to appreciate the profound editorial coherence that runs across this section of Jewish Bible, the now separate books we call Joshua to Kings. In fact, we've come to see that the editorial coherence actually begins in the last book of Torah's 5 scrolls, Deuteronomy. And so we have come to call this much longer, editorially coherent work, Deuteronomy to Kings, the Deuteronomic history, a record constructing an epic story for its region. Starting in the wilderness period of their ancestors, wandering Arameans, it says of them, through the arrival and miraculous capture of the land of Canaan, early tribal government under judges, Shophatim in Hebrew, then monarchical governments, Malkim, in the capital cities of the various Palestinian states, but especially in Jerusalem. This Deuteronomic history was likely composed after the collapse of all these monarchies. An early draft may have appeared as a tribute to one of the last royal heroes it presents, Josiah, attempting to centralize and renew Judean religious life in his capital, Jerusalem. But this last hero, caught in the crossfire between Egypt and Assyria, was killed during an Egyptian invasion of Palestine in 609 BCE. Scarcely 20 years later came the complete collapse of the Judean state, the new Mesopotamian power, Babylon. The editorial coherence of this reconstructed Deuteronomic history, then, invites us to read it not simply chapter by chapter or even book by book, but as one whole literary work. So what does the long told here? What does the long tale told here look like? It begins with that last will and testament speech of Moses to the now freed slaves at the edge of the new land, which many of them, however, are reluctant to enter. But Moses' exhortation here is directed not so much to their reluctance to enter the land as to his own uneasy feeling that once they do take up life there, they will forget the new social ethos in which he has been counseling them for 30 chapters or so. An ethos that, among other things, says, no murder, no theft, no coveting anything of your neighbors, not homes, not lands or labor, and no using the divine name to excuse promise breaking. But unfortunately, while there is editorial coherence to this narrative, there are also tensions running through the tale it tells, literarily, psychologically, and ethically. For that same speech does go on to counsel an ethnic cleansing of the land once the freed slaves have entered it, with Moses designating Joshua as the successor and military commander who will achieve this conquest. The narrative then moves on to recount Joshua's miraculously complete victories, catalog the 31 city-state kings whom he defeated, and list how the captured towns are to be parceled out to the former Hebrew slaves, tribe by tribe. Joshua has a farewell speech of his own before dying, and like Moses, Joshua is uneasy in his final words. The conquest is incomplete, he sees, precisely because the Hebrews have not lived up to their own ideals for life together in the new land. Incidentally, Joshua's speech gives us the title of one of those great Canadian prairie novels by Sinclair Ross. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. After Joshua, the story moves on to reflect on cycles of social political breakdown, followed by shorter and longer periods of recovery under a series of judges, charismatic figures who in succession rise to the occasion and rescue the shifting alliances of intertribal politics from foreign oppressors, yes, but as the story progresses, also from increasing conflict among the tribes themselves and competing claims to leadership among their various chiefs. A disastrous civil war brings one particular tribe targeted by the rest, Benjamin, almost to the point of extinction. At this point in the story, we read of the ever louder demand on the last judge Samuel to bring stability by appointing a king who will rule father to son. The Deuteronomic history does remember that there had already been at least 2 unsuccessful experiments with monarchy. In fact, it even includes some of the political satire that resisted the shift to kingship. The trees decide they should have a king. The elm declines because it has better use for its wood. The apple declines because its fruit is already committed. So who gets to be king? The thorn bush. Samuel acquiesces and appoints in succession 2 kings for the people. First Saul, then David. Samuel, or Samuel's God, Yahweh, one of them, however, soon becomes dissatisfied with their first choice. At one point, Saul, apparently without waiting for Samuel's signal, on his own initiative, took his forces into an important battle. At another, Saul showed diplomatic restraint in victory, where Samuel had demanded total annihilation. And this is the piece of this story that Netanyahu and his cabinet most love to cite. Samuel then chooses a young member of Saul's retinue, David, as the successor who would establish his own royal line. That line, however, according to the tale being told, lasts only 1 generation. His son Solomon's own son provokes the dissolution of David's federation into 2 competing kingdoms, north versus south. The Deuteronomic history finishes its tale of the rivals, clearly sympathetic with the southern Davidic royal family based in Jerusalem. Finally, as already mentioned, comes the complete collapse of all the various Palestinian states to the Babylonian forces in 586 BCE. Now, believe it or not, what I've just outlined is a very perfunctory review of what this Deuteronomic history we read is. My answer to how its how question, how it came together, is perhaps mercifully briefer. Literarily, this reconstructed history is quite uneven. It tumbles together frequently incomplete chronicles with speeches, songs, legends of heroes, satirical fables like the one I cited, genealogical lists, even what looked like tax rolls, with editorial summaries along the way trying to cover some of the obvious gaps. So the shorter answer to the how question of this book is that it was put together from a very uneven archive of source material, resulting in literary tensions that in film we might call problems of continuity, such as, was the conquest of the land of Canaan ever completed or not? Why did some of the various Hebrew tribal alliances keep breaking down? And conversely, what was behind the treaties that at least some of the tribes made with the other peoples of Canaan? Why did some tribes accept the charismatic leadership of judges and others ignore them? And did charismatic leadership by judges actually work or not, given the dysfunction that various of them seem to have had even within their own families, the great Samuel included? And were the Philistine foe or friend to David in the struggle to succeed Saul when they gave David on the run a safety and a haven? And finally, was kingship in the end a good idea or not? And if it was, then why did the nation ruled by kings finally collapse? My colleague David Jobling, who's written extensively on this part of the former prophets, said, The Deuteronomist's hopes for continuity founder on the stubborn fragmentariness of the story they try to tell. The how of this reconstructed history then leads us on to its why and when. For the issues that we see this text grappling with are not those of the much earlier, once upon a times it is ostensibly presenting, but issues of its own much later time of writing, of their land and its various peoples, Israelite, Edomite, Moabite, Ammonite, Philistine, peoples now incorporated into the succession of empires that consumed them, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek. Both the Assyrian and Babylonian onslaughts on Palestine had scattered peoples in many directions, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Arabia. And of course, the poorest with no travel options were left behind to scratch out their living in the ruins that had been their land. But with the triumph of the Persians under Cyrus over the Babylonians in 539 BCE, came an opportunity for refugees to return and begin rebuilding a collective life for their people within this new Persian Empire. Even in Babylon itself, by the way, the Persians were welcomed as liberators. The only requirements from the Persian masters for these reconstruction projects was that the returning peoples provide the Persian governors with a summary of the laws they would be following in the land, the rituals that they would be conducting in its rebuilt temples, and the commitment to making daily offering to the god of said temples on behalf of the Persian emperor's good health. The Persians like to hedge their bets. For the returning refugees, meeting these requirements involved the serious scribal work of finding usable memories, to use a phrase of David Jobling's, during this time of imperial subjugation. And so Hebrew scribes pulled together such documentation as was available in order to satisfy the terms for return that the Persian administrators were allowing. The Torah, which summarized the stories of ancient ancestors and the laws and customs they had taught, as well as the reconstructed epic of their subsequent descendants that we have been calling the Deuteronomic history, to substantiate legendary claims to the region. Hence the inclusion of seemingly boring genealogies, town lists, and tax rolls. Also understandable, given the first intended readership of this document, the Persians, is the rather horrific accounts of fierce battles fought. The Persian masters needed to know that at least some of the nations they had conquered were no pushovers. The Persians needed to be assured they had met and conquered worthy opponents. In the scramble to supply the required documentation, there are, however, not only literary tensions within the Deuteronomic history that the Hebrew scribes constructed for their Persian masters. There are also certain social psychological tensions that come out of its competing ways of trying to remember former times, ways of remembering that keep appearing sometimes in spite of authorial intention. Over against the memory of Israel's old imperial glory, for example, Joshua's sometimes brilliantly clever ways of stunning his enemies. There are also counter-memories of coexistent with dominant aliens, of the Philistine, for example, who offered David on the run refuge from Saul, who was trying to kill him. And alongside these competing forms of remembering, a third way, a memory, a dim memory, a hopeful memory of a just society without domination from outside or inside. Every one neath their vine and fig tree, in peace and unafraid. The line of ancient Hebrew poetry would like to remember it. To read this biblical history as a whole, then, invites listening for its own unease as it tries to construct a credible claim to the land for imperial masters, from details it cannot remember with any satisfaction and voices it knows it failed to heed. I once described the Deuteronomic history to friends Dan and Carol as a tortured story produced by the bad conscience of a failed state. Or in the more charitable words of David Jobling, it owes some of its characteristics to a sense of guilt that the national work of remembering that it enshrines has not been fully national at all, that certain voices have been excluded. An ethical reading of the Deuteronomic history, then, begins by reading it as a whole, through all its tensions of conflicting form, fragmentary content, and tortured conscience. It requires reading with an eye and an ear, both from the memories it triumphs and the memories it attempts to suppress. To those who would read themselves into convenient bits and pieces of its conquest narratives, as the self-justifying script for theft of lands not their own, I would offer this word of caution. If you read this text as carefully as it demands to be read, all of it, you may find yourself having to ask and answer hard questions about the empire in which you have so readily embedded yourself. When it all collapses, as it will, that's the script, as it will, how much of its envy, theft, murder, and abuse of God's name will you allow yourself to remember? The Torah and the former prophets of the Deuteronomic history were not the only literary products that the refugees from ancient Palestine brought back with them. Other recovered and reimagined texts were also incorporated into the Jewish Bible. What we see in the resultant collection, however, is evidence of rival visions of how the people might rebuild a social life together. The follow-up history in Jewish Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah, for example, idealizes an ethnically pure people in which the foreign women of mixed marriages and their children are, with much piety but little pity, simply abandoned. By contrast, one of the little novels of that same Bible, Ruth, explicitly spells out that the great-grandmother of the hero King David was herself one of those foreign women, a Moabite, in fact, Judean eventually, not by bloodline, but by personal commitment to the clan of her mother-in-law. A similar contrast can be found within the little collection of the 12 of which Amos was a part. One of those 12, Nahum, happily gathers 3 chapters of vicious curse to call down on Nineveh, capital city of the Assyrians, who so ruthlessly destroyed the various kingdoms of ancient Palestine: Israel, Judah, Moab, Edom. But another of those 12 tells the tale of Jonah, another prophet, who, when he realizes Yahweh wants first a word of warning rather than curse addressed to the enemy city, he runs down to catch the first boat heading to the opposite end of the Mediterranean, only to end up where, famously? Spending 3 days in the belly of a great fish. Jonah's reluctance to deliver the message came from his own prophetic insight that Yahweh's word of warning, damn it, would be effective. those damnable Assyrians would repent, and Yahweh, soft touch that he is, would let them off the hook, which, according to the tale told, is precisely what does happen when Jonah finally fulfills his commission. Even the enemy, according to Jonah, in contrast to Nahum, can be included in the circles of reconciliation when refugees return. So what about those watchwords of dispossession that we frequently hear touted as land is stolen and children die? Chosen people and promised land. In Jewish Bible, when Yahweh chooses, Bahar is the Hebrew verb most frequently behind the English translation. Bahar implies a trial, a testing, a process of evaluation. Yahweh chooses, puts to the test particular persons for leadership, particular places for gathering, particular times for encounter. And at those times and places of encounter, that struggle of self-evaluation will occur that we have come to call vocation. When persons and peoples face the question together, what's to be done? As for what in Jewish Bible Yahweh promises, here we have what strikes me as a bit of overtranslation of the Hebrew verbs amar and davar, which more simply mean say and speak. When Yahweh speaks, of course, as Jonah well knew, it was always effective. But along with speaking to the Hebrew slaves about a land of milk and honey, Yahweh also speaks of light on a dark path, of wisdom in times of foolishness, and more generally of blessing and goodness for life together with both neighbor and stranger in the land. When Jewish Bible uses these words then, choose, promise, i.e. speak, our reading needs to listen for the attention it is given to how life with neighbor is to be effected on any promised land and the ethical testing any nation must undergo that considers itself chosen. The opening book of Torah, Genesis, reports Yahweh meeting an ancient East Mediterranean couple, Abraham and Sarah, and telling them, "You will be a blessing to all nations." And in time, certain streams of Judaism developed that inclusive picture of Father Abraham, not simply as an admittedly flawed hero of the past, but as an advocate and comforter who would be there ahead of us to meet us with a welcome into a new and better age, who would gather all the children abandoned and lost in this age and take them to hold in his bosom, Father Abraham, where they would at last be safe and happy and complete. May all the children of Turtle Island and of Palestine, robbed of land and life across these past unhappy centuries, across this past year, find in Abraham's bosom justice and mercy, loving kindness and truth, and peace. Shalom, salam. Thank you for your attention. Yeah.
So if you have questions,
Okay.
That way they'll catch it on the live stream.
Okay. Sure. Sure. Sure.
All right. Anyone with questions?
Yes, Katie. Subjugation? Yeah. Okay, yes. Yeah. Yeah. It means that it's the way empires control people. And as last week we heard an important pair of scholars talking about settler colonial societies and how empires work in that. It's evolved. Not all empires work the same way. In this time, mainly empires came in with their armies and say, okay, you owe us taxes. If you put up the money, that was the end of things. And that's why the Persians could say, just tell us the laws you're following, what you're doing in your temples, make sure you pray for our emperor, and as long as the cash is coming in, we're fine with whatever you do. But that's how that subjugation. Yeah. Yes, Nabucco.
I didn't quite get what you were trying to say about the trees, and they're taken to trees, and the apple and the orange, and I thought,
Okay. What you do there is you go to the book of Judges, and it's Jotham's parable. Jotham's brother wanted to be king, Abimelech, and Jotham and part of Abimelech's first stage of claiming kingship is murder all your brothers. So Jotham is on the run, and he gives this parable about, the trees wanted to pick a king once, and what they got was a scrub bush. That's the short version of Jotham's parable. So it's part of within the Deuteronomic history, even though it tells how kingship arises. It keeps telling these stories about, well, maybe kingship really wasn't a good idea, even though that's what we ended up with. And it. Okay. Yeah. No, it was thornbush. Thornbush was the one. Thornbush, yes. Yeah. Yeah, right. Oranges have thorns, but they also have fruit. This was just, the thorn bush. Yeah, Renee? That's the people that Saul showed some restraint on. They had, part of the wandering story is that as the Hebrews freed slaves sort of wandered, different nations gave them hospitality and some did not. And so there was Amalek, the people of Amalek were people who did not offer hospitality, and Samuel had a real hate on for them. And so when Saul won a victory over them, he spared their king. And Samuel was ticked off with him and said, I'm going to find another king. So, and that's one of the examples of Joshua is quite a brutal book in terms of how it describes conquest of whole cities being put to the sword. And again, part of the reason I think the Hebrew scribes in the Persian period included those stories is they needed to show the Persians they were tough guys. Something very similar happens much later in Jewish history. Josephus wrote a similar kind of account of his own people for the Romans to explain, we were tough people that you won, good on you that you beat us, but it wasn't easy.
Okay, I'm going to, if it's okay with you, Bill,
Sure.
I'm going to repeat the question.
Okay, sorry,
because
yes.
I think what's happening is we're losing the question in the live stream. So the question is, Renee, did you have a question? Where does Amalek fit in? So that was the previous question that Bill just answered. Thank you. Okay. is the popular song, Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. Is that still in the hymn books?
None that I know, and it hasn't been for, I think that would probably have been in, Sandra being the historian of 19th century church history, it probably comes out of that tradition. Again, those conquest stories of Joshua, they're meant to show that they're a clever people. Joshua used a sort of attacked at night with lights under bushels, which he then showed so that the element of surprise. So a number of the stories have these tales of kind of clever ways of stunning the enemy, taking the enemy by surprise. Yeah,
Okay.
Vicki.
Question there? Yep.
Bill, you and I are kind of the same vintage. We all read those 1,000 pages of Norman Rockwell at one point. Do you remember that?
Yeah, Norman. He was up on the acknowledgments.
Rockwell says it wasn't a case of this race called Hebrew slaves coming in to destroy a race called Canaanites. It was actually a mutual resistance movement that was more class-based. In other words, Canaan was very stratified. There were overlords. And these people from the desert made common cause with some of the, we call them now, I don't know what, working class or partisans to work for a more equitable society. So he ends up reframing the whole thing, not along ethnic lines. Can I just ask a question? You remember that too?
I think my colleague David Jobling, who worked in this area, was a very careful reader of Gottwald's work. And this is where, in those usable memories, David talks about these hopeful memories of a time of a just society without subjugation from inside or outside. I think, honestly, Gottwald's is a very wishful reconstructing of a time that we have no access to. Again, that's where, in David Jobling's sort of listing of memories, this takes us back where it's the past we wished was there. We don't have evidence. The only evidence we have of it is that the word Hebrew does not seem to be a race term, where it does appear in other non-biblical texts of the time. It looks like it means migrant worker. There's some ancient Near Eastern texts that refer to the hapiru, and we think that's the connection. Yeah.
Okay, Lynn. Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay.
So the question is about the ethics of looking at those texts and sort of how to work with them in the media, like in the current situation. And is that correct, Lynn? Yeah. I'll let Bill answer.
Okay. In terms of dealing with the media, myself, I think it's pointless. Okay. The media, the mainstream media shuts out the stories. So in a way, I'll save my breath to cool my porridge, as my grandmother said. The ethics of reading, what I was trying to say there is, an ethical reading of a text reads the whole story. That you don't pick out your favorite bits. And as I said, if you're going to insert yourself into the story as your script, then you follow it all the way, and which ends with you as a prisoner of war in Babylon. Is that the story you really want to follow? So it's the story as a whole. You can't just live a bit of it. That's the ethic of reading that you owe to the authors, any author, to read the whole thing. I think part of the other ethic, the ethical question around reading is, why are we reading ourselves so keenly into this ancient text and we don't even know our own story? We don't even know the empire in which we live. We don't, with the Palestinians or First Nations, we haven't listened to their whole story of what their reaction has been, what they have been reacting to. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm hearing this kind of the save your breath thing for cooling your porridge. At the same time, I hear within the larger narrative sub-narratives or counter-narratives that have always kind of popped their heads up in different places. And I understand you saying don't use one little portion of that, but how can we effectively try to share a counter-narrative? How did they do it, and how can we do it?
So the question is about the way the narrative is used, but keeping in mind there's counter-narratives throughout. How do we create an effective counter-narrative to some of what is being used in this situation?
I think it's important to realize that since I'm talking about ancient Palestine was not ethnically homogeneous. Different peoples lived there. They had to get along. They had to get along out of different iconographies for God. We think God sits on a pair of angels between their wings. Oh, we think it sits between the horns of a bull. They lived with each other. And so part of what David was saying in listening for the other voices is listen to the voice of your neighbors who has a different faith from you and build things together. If the wall is leaning over and you're having to decide, tear it down or rebuild, find the neighbor who's going to help you with that, who's maybe on the other side of that wall. I am struck in our rallies, our weekly rallies, our demonstrations, the people who come from many different faith commitments and backgrounds, and they greet each other with affection, and they ask how their week was. Some of them are struggling with putting together bits and pieces of jobs. They're at schools. They're under pressure in workplaces. They lost one job because of they couldn't. The working environment was so hostile to them. They support each other, and every Sunday afternoon they walk along beside each other and support each other. And that to me is more important than trying to get the media to tell the right story. It's to walk with Muslim, Jewish neighbors who are walking in that rally and saying we're here together. Today, for example, one of our people told a story about sending a video from our rally on Saturday to his father in Jordan, Palestinians. He says, my father's a tough guy. And this is a video call they're doing. My father's a tough guy, but I showed him all the people who were out on Saturday walking along 8th Street. And he said, my dad started to cry. Because he says, you're 5,000 miles away, and there are people there who support us, who are listening for our story, who are listening for putting our voice into this story. Yeah. So I'd say our best bet is to find those folks in the struggle and walk with them. Do what you can. Ask them how their week went. Yeah. Help them track down a job.
Great, and that it seems like a fairly good place to wrap up, unless,
That's good.
Vicki, do you have, okay. But what I'm going to invite you to do is stick around and have a visit with Bill afterwards. I just wonder, there was a few folks who wanted to just give a little announcement about some of the things at the back. I just would remind you to stop at the table, and there are the black ribbons. Please take a black ribbon to wear over the coming days. Anyone who needs to make an announcement, come on up here. I think Ursula's gonna. While Ursula's making her way to the front, I just want to say thank you so much, Bill, for tonight. That was wonderful. Ursula, can you come up this way and use the mic here? Yeah.
The next event in this series is on Tuesday, October the 15th, 7 p.m. at Grosvenor Park United Church. And this event is listening for God's prophetic voice amongst the people of the land. And in this event, which is co-sponsored with Mennonite Central Committee, going to have representatives from the Canadian Food Bank. And Rick Block, Miriam Harder, and I think possibly somebody else as well. Miriam Harder is the senior program officer for the Middle East region. She'll be presenting on Zoom. And they're going to share historical and current context from Canada and the Palestinian territories in how land, identity, and conflict can create tragic circumstances, but also bring springs of hope, resilience, and unity. This is a participatory event which will include table group discussions for in-person and online participants, as well as various calls to action and prayer. And so this is the poster. You can get it online, and it's at Grosvenor next week on Tuesday. The other thing I just want to mention is one way you can support the Palestinians, apart from through the food bank and probably your own churches, is a gift of hope, the olive tree saplings. And there's a little flyer here. You can use it, sponsor a tree through the United Church's Gifts with Vision. Also Zatoun, where we got the olive oil from, offers tree sponsorships as well. So you can take a flyer as well. I think that's all from me. Thanks.
Great. Those actually follow up so nicely on what Bill was saying. Those are the things that we can do to create a counter-narrative to what's going on. Yeah. So thank you, Ursula. There is also a sheet there with a whole list of things, places that you can write, invitations to be part of local groups that are out there on 8th Street walking each week. And Ursula said that the Canadian Food Grains Bank event was this week on Tuesday. It's actually a week from this Tuesday. It's on the 15th. So it's in connection to World Food Day, which is the 16th of October, right? So have a look at the other events that are going on throughout the month of October. And again, a huge thank you to Bill Richards for being with us tonight. And thank you all for being here. Good night.